Hi there, Mai. Welcome to this video about the second of Jacob Nielsen's usability heuristics, match between system and the real world. In this video, we'll go on a journey through why this heuristic matters and what it can look like. How many of you have ever used a floppy disk? I'm going to put my bets on none, if any. Technology supporting these disks was phased out of most consumer-level personal computers before this year's Year 11s were even born. Once upon a time, though, these disks were the newest tech for saving files and making them portable for use between computers, even though their maximum capacity was often less than 1 megabyte. That's still enough to carry a Microsoft Word document, but not your average PDF. Still, the floppy disk, or its effigy, perseveres because at the time when many graphical user interfaces, or GUI applications, were first being developed and used, it was the standard for file storage. So the use of the floppy disk as the save icon made sense, at the time anyway. Once it became the accepted norm, it was used for consistency, and it's still used today. This is an example of heuristic number 2, match between system and the real world, but it's also kind of not. Match between system and the real world suggests that a design should speak the user's language. It should use words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user, rather than internal jargon. It should also follow real-world conventions, making information appear in a natural and logical order. If your phone has a digital wallet, you might see that the different digital cards stored are designed to look like the real-life version of the same card. They don't have to look like that. It doesn't increase in functionality in any way, but it does make it easier for you to identify what the digital function of that feature is. If visibility of system status builds trust because of open communication, match between system and the real world helps us trust a user interface because it's familiar to us, even if we've never used it before. Remember the story about the floppy disk and the save icon? That's an example of skeuomorphism. Skeuomorphism is one aspect of this heuristic. It's the act of creating user interfaces and interactions that mimic the real world. It makes sense that this was an important early feature of interface design when the majority of users were not yet digital natives. Creating UIs that look like real-life environments creates a sense of familiarity and trust for users who haven't grown up using digital devices, like you have. But in the last 10 years, a long time in design anthropology, skeuomorphism has become a bit of an in-joke, just like the one at the beginning of this video. Have you ever thought about the fact that we not only use the floppy disk as the save icon, but we also use a wired telephone symbol for phone calls, or a cog for system settings, even though they're not mechanical devices? When was the last time that you used a floppy disk, or a wired telephone, or a mechanical cog? Probably never, right? These icons have become more closely associated with their digital function than their ability to mimic the real world. It's important to learn about skeuomorphism, but contemporary design favours the next iteration of this theory. In the early 2010s, just a few years after the iPhone was first released, and thus smartphones became the newest iteration of the cell phone, designers started moving away from skeuomorphism. Digital devices very quickly became ubiquitous objects in our lives, and digital environments no longer needed to resemble our real-life environments to build trust in the majority of users. So, flat design became the norm. However, skeuomorphism is still present in many user interfaces in its more subtle forms, used for both icons and animation behaviors that resemble actions we might take in the real world. The projected next iteration of this design trend is neomorphism, a term created by art director and design writer Jason Kelly. It has also been shortened by others to neomorphism. Unlike skeuomorphism, which attempts to mimic real-life interactions in digital interfaces, neomorphism creates simplified versions of these real-life environments that are optimized for aesthetic and user enjoyment. While neomorphism isn't strictly an example of heuristic 2 in the way that skeuomorphism is, it does reflect how users' needs for matching between system and the real world change over time. We don't need a perfect recreation of the real world in our digital devices anymore. And the thing is, the real world is just a matter of perspective. What's real to some people can be fake news to others. Our experiences in the COVID-19 pandemic have shown us this much. So matching the system in the real world is not always going to be straightforward. A great example of this is scroll directionality. If you have ever used both a Windows and Mac computer, you might have noticed this, or you might be so used to it by now, it's automatic. If you do have both to hand, have a go at scrolling and notice how your computer behaves. On Mac computers, if you wanted to continue reading text down the page, you'll scroll up. That's because the scroll direction is set to move the page itself. They call this natural scrolling. However, on Windows computers, you'll scroll down. That's because Windows behaves as though the scroll is moving the viewing area, not the page itself. Weird, huh? And this is called reverse scrolling. It's worth remembering that while these usability heuristics are general principles, they're not specific guidelines for UI/UX design. As we evolve and become more accustomed to certain behaviors in our real and digital lives, what makes good or bad usability will change. Because these are not fixed concepts, it also means that there aren't any right or wrong answers for your exam. You will be marked on your ability to articulate how specific features achieve the goals of the heuristics. While there might be some more obvious answers than others, there are so many different ways to creatively apply these concepts to user interfaces. What might look like good usability to you might create a different experience for someone else. And that's a good thing. Neurodiversity is an important consideration in human evolution. Let's have a look at this heuristic at work by looking at an article on medium.com about Neomorphism. So the first thing that we'll notice about medium.com is it definitely favors flat design. And there's a great example of skeuomorphism right at the top with the magnifying glass. Now, hopefully we all understand that a magnifying glass on a website usually means a search bar. So when we click that, a search bar appears, which is pretty cool. And there's a little bit of visibility system status here because, of course, when I click it, the visibility, the search bar appears magically, which is pretty great. If I hover over these areas here, they subtly change color, so it's not super obvious, but it's just enough to know that I am definitely interacting and the website is responding to my interactions. Let's scroll down. We have got another example of visibility of system status here. Tells me that it's going to take a 7-minute read. This is super helpful, and you'll notice it on a lot of different article websites now. It just helps you anticipate, okay, so how long is it going to take? Because, of course, you can see on the scroll bar, this seems like a pretty long article. So that might put off some users from reading it, but it says 7 minutes. I've got 7 minutes on a coffee break. I am going to read this article. Now, let's try highlighting. So I can just drag my cursor over here and this little menu pops up. I click the highlighter, boom. That looks a lot like what highlighting looks like in the real life, right? So if I wanted to highlight an actual page, I would just take a highlighter and then drag it over the text that I wanted to highlight. So that's another example of match between system and the real world. You can also see in this menu here, you've got some icons available. So if I wanted to clap for or celebrate the article, there's 2 clapping hands here. So I know that if I click this, it's going to add to that number here, another visibility of system status going on here. There's 45 comments, so I can see really clearly that a lot of people have interacted with this article. And the speech bubble indicates that that's a comment. There's a couple of heuristics at work here, consistency and standards, which we'll cover in a couple of videos. And then there's the bookmark. So if I wanted to add this to my bookmarks, I would just click and it adds it. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Now, of course, because I'm on a Windows computer, scrolling down is going to reveal the rest of the article to me. But if I was on a Mac, I would actually be scrolling up to see the rest of the article. Nice. Let's recap for retrieval. The second Nielsen heuristic is match between system and the real world, that design should speak the user's language, that it should use words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user rather than a turtle jargon, and it should follow real-world conventions, making information appear in a natural and logical order. Skeuomorphism is just one of the ways this heuristic can be followed. Skeuomorphism is the action of mimicking objects or items in the real world, such as designing a music recording app around the audio mixer of a recording studio. You can also see skeuomorphism in the use of everyday objects for icons, such as a house for home, a floppy disk for the save icon, or a speech bubble for sending a text message. Matching systems in the real world is complex though, because the real world is open to interpretation. Understanding your user and what's real to them is the key to good design and good usability. Ngā mihi kia koutou. Thanks for watching, team. Remember, you can always reach out by email, through Discord, or by coming along to our class sessions if you need any help. From me and Gary, kia kite, kia haumaru te noho.